What's up, everybody? It's Khalil here with another episode of the HoneyPot Podcast. Today's guest has been in the social listening game long enough to know the difference between noise and a narrative. And trust us, Rob has all the juice we need today. As the senior manager of social listening and operations at Keurig Dr Pepper, Rob's the guy turning millions of conversations into crystal clear brand insights and strategies. He's also a social intelligence lab top 50 Hall of Famer. And yes, that is a real Hall of Fame. He's goated for sure. But whether he's tracking what people are saying about your favorite soda or helping execs connect the dots between online buzz and business outcome, Rob's work lives in the intersection of insights and impact. And before his current posts, he made waves at DraftKings, Starry, and even an event marketing company. So when we say he understands that full brand experience, we really mean it. This isn't going to be an episode. This is going to be a masterclass in operationalizing social data influence from the inside and providing that smart listening capabilities to organizations. So without further ado, Rob, thank you for joining the pod, man. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Khalil. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, yeah, for sure, man. I'm glad that you're in a good mood. I see your jersey in the background. We don't have to talk about it. I hurt with you.
I prefer not.
I hurt with you, right? I'm a Celtics fan.
There we go.
The NBA playoffs is always a heartbreaker, but I know you Boston fans love your Celtics, man. Sorry they couldn't pull it through, but
no, that we do.
Yeah, man. But I appreciate you joining the pod, man, and I wanted to really just like we were mentioning before in the green room or whatever, how this podcast is built to kind of help that individual that wants to be promoted or take their career to the next level feel more comfortable about having these conversations. And I think it really starts with understanding how to turn the light switch on for some of these stakeholders. So when you are doing the work that you do internally at Keurig Dr Pepper, how do you make stakeholders feel personally invested in the insights that you present to them?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the $1 million question, right? Is trying to kind of incite that interest and get that buy-in, but also ensure that the stakeholders that you're sharing the work with do feel that level of investment and interest and intrigue. And I kind of would boil it down to, and kind of my experience is this notion of kind of speed. It's also relevance, and then sort of the notion of actionable storytelling. So kind of, taking that and breaking that down, the quicker you can provide something that is relatable to those stakeholders, and then at the same time it's actionable in nature, the more likely you're going to see kind of that stakeholder intrigue and that sort of organic reception.
Mm-hmm.
And, ultimately they're going to want to learn more, or, you'll have their ear and their attention. So, you want to make sure that what you're sharing kind of makes the stakeholder pause and want to kind of dive in a little bit deeper. Mm-hmm. They should be kind of saying like, oh, I didn't know that, or, oh, that's really interesting, or maybe we should do something like this. So I think it kind of boils down to sort of emphasizing kind of like human-centered stories, like, framing that data and those real voices that we can pull from social media. Mm-hmm. and really kind of help, provide those verbatims and quotes from consumers that show like, hey, this product is actually hitting in this market, or hey, there might be an issue here that we should pivot and consider doing something a little differently, and sort of building like a kind of persona that kind of mirrors that stakeholder's sort of target demo, or mm-hmm. Whatever they're after. So I think it really is a combination of kind of, how quickly can you do it, how relevant can you make it, and then how actionable is it for those stakeholders to kind of build that inherent mm-hmm. invested feeling.
So coming from that perspective of maybe someone that might not have as much bandwidth or ability, and maybe they're in that role and they're manually looking through TikToks or something like that, for that stakeholder, like because you go back to that speed, relevant, and actionable side of it. How do you make sure that you check all those boxes while you have limited bandwidth, while you're trying to make this? Because again, a lot of these people might even be in situations where social insights aren't even like being taken seriously.
Yeah,
So
it's not
like,
done yet. Yeah.
how do you know what's fast enough? How do you know what's relevant, and how do you know what's actionable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of sort of test and learn, and it's an iterative process. That's at least how it's been in my experience. And uh, I've certainly found opportunities along the way to improve on those moments where bandwidth has been really hard to come by, and it's sort of making the most of the situation and the resources that you do have. I mean, it's definitely a balancing act. There's no doubt about that. You control what you control, and kind of in order to manage the expectations effectively, you have to ultimately set them. So I think it kind of starts with being as transparent around like what's possible with, transparent to yourself, but also the people that you're working with,
Mm-hmm.
and making it very clear, hey, here are the limitations and the caveats that, are going to be part of this, information, this deliverable, this report that I'm going to provide you, because that's super super important. And then it's easier said than done, but this has sort of been one area where I've had to certainly emphasize and improve. But essentially, just like don't bite off more than you can chew.
Mm-hmm.
I for one fall victim to this all the time when I'm trying to do too much at once, and have a hard time saying no to an ask because I think it might again further justify my my remit and the work that we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do here at KDP. So I think it's about being realistic, like I said, and sort of managing those expectations with yourself. But I think more tactically, kind of like set the frame early, clearly communicate what's in scope and what's not, and sort of manage those expectations, kind of like a project manager, not just someone that's conducting the research or working in the dashboards or building out queries or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, kind of more tactically, but prioritize. That should be kind of like the focal point of how you kind of go about dealing with that limited bandwidth. So kind of focusing on like what's must know insights over like nice to know, and then sort of using a type of methodology or your own kind of personal triage approach to kind of figure out what's sort of landing the most or driving the most impact with the audience. And then last thing I'd recommend in that instance is just like go for the quick wins. If you can templatize stuff, do it. Self-serve dashboards can certainly be beneficial. They can also lead to more questions, which
Mm-hmm.
can also put a strain on your bandwidth. But that can certainly kind of be a pathway into trying to scale
Mm-hmm.
and kind of counteract that limited bandwidth. And then also just on top of those quick wins, like smaller, for example, like trend summaries, to provide value, kind of while protecting, ultimately your time, which is sort of the underlying issue. But
Yeah.
it's not easy. It's a learning process, and I've certainly come a long way in this department, but I'm still learning.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned like templates and like having like formats, because if you're in an organization where the social intelligence practice is non-existent, then you're essentially a new brand.
Yep.
And it makes sense to kind of, and I feel like Danny from Helion talked about this on the pod before. Ben Ellis talked about this on the pod before as well, and now you're kind of bringing that up in the same vein that you're putting a format or workflow in place that is going to support the company eventually, and if it's the same and consistent every time, then people start getting used to it, right? So I think that
Absolutely.
was like the hidden value, and reading between the lines of what you're saying is like you're almost like a consultant, an internal consultant of your own department in that regard, because you got to fight for the budget,
Absolutely.
right? And
Absolutely.
and that kind of goes back into um, framing up these insights, or packaging it up. What are some of those ways when you're presenting these insights, that you are templating it, branding it, and kind of trying to make it something that can live over and over and over within the organization? Like, what are some of those ideas behind that?
Yeah. I mean, it's super important. I've found kind of the way that content is ultimately shared sometimes is just as important, if not more important than the content itself,
Mm-hmm.
especially in this world where we're still kind of relatively niche as far as the idea or kind of foundationally what social listening intelligence is, at least for certain organizations that maybe don't have it kind of more established. So there's this sort of inherent requirement to handhold and kind of be abundantly descriptive around, what things mean, whether it's a specific metric, defining that for somebody, understanding, and bringing to life the data visually, or in my experience personally, the most important kind of caveat and necessity when it comes to framing or packaging is providing benchmarks, sort of that contextual relevant information, to help understand, and making sure what ultimately you're delivering kind of lands properly. So, we always try in our deliverables and how we package stuff to answer that question, like, well, how do I know this is good? And, when thinking about something like, how many mentions your brand or a specific product got, or the sentiment or the net sentiment and how that stacks up to historical data, I think is super important. Or, a similar situation, a similar product launch or similar initiative, or even a competitor brand. I think, the framing and packaging is super important, but I also think having that context and sort of those benchmarks as part of it go a long way in sort of articulating the results, in a helpful manner. And I think, that packaging, the notion of packaging, I think makes or breaks the engagement that you'll see from the stakeholders. Because ultimately an insight is only as good as the delivery. And so design definitely matters. That the headlines that you're using on the reports or in the email communications, the flow of it, the emotional tone, I think that all plays an important role that, is certainly something to be mindful of. But it is also iterative, and you're going to figure out eventually what lands, the most for specific audiences. And, I've also really found that using narrative structures and kind of framing the findings as here's a problem or, an issue or a hypothesis, here's an insight, and then here's the opportunity. That sort of arc and framing structure is what I have found resonates most with the broadest of audiences. So, we're talking, in my instance, it's brand team members or product innovation team members or consumer insights teams. So I think it helps kind of for the stakeholders to understand not just what the data says, but what to do with it. And so, on top of all that, we talked about a little bit kind of the design of the packaging and the materials you're sharing, but, creativity is certainly part of that. The storytelling that you're layering in should also certainly be part of how you're thinking about sort of the overarching deliverable. And I think ultimately knowing your audience and tailoring the format to that is what you're going to want to do. But you may not know the audience right off the bat, and you'll eventually kind of understand and see what is resonating the most. So there's a lot at play when it comes to the kind of framing or packaging. But I do believe there's no true playbook to it. I think it's going to be very customized based off of your own personal experience.
I don't think that there's a playbook, but there are mechanics, right?
Totally.
And I think one of the things that you kind of said, and Frank literally just said the same thing, is that you kind of start with something that's going to make sure that those stakeholders sit up in their seats a little bit. So he was saying start off with a video of the consumer displaying whatever behaviors that is a part of that narrative, whether it's good or bad. And then the videos usually get people to sit up and look because it's a video. And then you kind of go and tell your story from there. So I love that aspect of it. How you kind of said the same thing is packaging it up the right way, but it's more about, making sure that going back to speed, relevant, and then actionable too, right? Making sure that element is there too. But you mentioned, kind of going across different teams or departments. When you are trying to build this credibility and you are trying to figure out how you want to brand it and get things rolling, how do you build that credibility and influence across different teams and or different departments?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, consistency is key here. Sort of once you're able to demonstrate the value of the work that you're building out and delivering more than just a handful of times, it becomes a lot easier to create that credibility and have that influence. And so I think, this notion of showing up consistently and translating those insights into the team's, goals or the areas that they're most interested in, whether for me it's marketing or comms or R&D, whatever it might be. I think that is first and foremost like the focal point of trying to kind of establish that credibility. And then, coming equipped with, the information that matters, we talked about that a little bit already, but, bringing the receipts, right? Like you want to use data to back up your ideas, and, you want to kind of blend it too. In this world of AI, it's just as important to have HI, human intelligence, layered on top of that. So sort of the storytelling comes into play here, along with the way that you're creatively sharing that information in a format and in a forum that is going to resonate with the audience. And so, kind of using data to back up your ideas, but staying human, like that's really, really important. And then, sort of avoiding this notion of being robotic, like here's the same report, here's the same information. Like, is there anything in there that you can make it stand out? Whether it's like, a catchy headline, as I alluded to, or some type of intriguing sort of open-ended thought on like, hey, this is a potential action we can consider if X, Y, or Z, was done. And so I think you want to kind of start sort of helping teams sort of think a little bit outside the box of what they can do with this information, because as we all know, like social intelligence data is kind of like, it's cliche, but it's like, the world's largest focus group. So how can you channel that into a deliverable that's going to feel customized for the audience, and then also ultimately kind of help build that credibility. So I think there's not a one size fits all sort of move here, but I think you'll gradually see more of that trust and that influence as you're more consistent with delivering on this type of work.
Yeah, I think it's important to say this too, because I'm Geronimo, right? I'm gonna reach out to the stakeholder myself, and internally, that's why I had a lot of problems in corporate America, right? I didn't follow the pecking order. Would you say it's a smart idea to focus on your stakeholder or your immediate, superior, and have them introduce you, or would you go straight to those departments yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's right. It's a balancing act of, you don't want to overstep, and you don't want to, and again, depending on the organization you're working for and sort of the rules of engagement and how much kind of maybe politics or red tape exists, the answer could be totally different. But what I have found is that, like, if the information that you're providing is valuable and good enough, like, different people will see it. And that's kind of been one of the ways that internally, as like our social intelligence program has grown, like the way that we've judged and like, essentially created KPIs for ourselves around success, like what success looks like for a social intelligence program, is around like our literal distribution list, like how those have grown. So like when we're putting together, for example, like on a weekly basis, we send out every Monday for a handful of our brands, like a weekly, call it a digest, a brand health report, whatever you want to call it. But we send that out on a weekly basis. And the way that we've seen those distribution lists, like literally the number of emails that are on those sends go up on a consistent, week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year. That's how we've sort of kind of indicated to ourselves, like, we're building that credibility, we're building that trust, we're building that influence, but we're also getting recognized more, because people will get forwarded one of our reports and be like, hey, did you see this? And they're like, oh no, I want to be added to the distribution list. I want to see this every single week if you guys are saying this weekly, or if it's monthly, whatever it might be. So I don't think it's like necessary to immediately sort of circumvent some of like the hierarchy that exists right off the bat. I think if your work is good enough and credible enough, you will start to see sort of the tentacles within the organization sort of expand and have sort of those touch points become, sort of more widespread. And I think that takes time, and that takes, sort of, again, test and learn, and you're just gonna have to continue to kind of show up, and that consistency is sort of the driver there. But that's kind of how we thought about success, and that's what's gotten us to sort of the point of credibility that we have today.
Yeah, let the data speak for itself, right? But again, relevant, actionable, all those pieces have to be there to kind of create this digest or this report that grows over time, right? So, but when you get those pieces, all those pieces in the right places, and all those moving parts happening, and you may have gotten a little budget to get a tool or two, right? And now you got some help. How do you ensure that the insights are not only heard but acted upon? Like, in a meaningful way too? Like how do you drive home the actionable side of everything?
Yeah. You know, this has sort of been my biggest challenge, I think, as I've grown the program here at Keurig Dr Pepper. And I think when I talk to peers that work in the space, you know, they echo the same thing, that it's, you know, the work that you're doing is only as good as if it gets actioned on, you know, by the audience and the stakeholders that you're sharing it with. So as much of a challenge it is, it's also like one of the most critical components, because, you know, the way that you operationalize social intelligence data can sort of prove out the concept and sort of demonstrate and showcase that value almost immediately if it's done correctly. So kind of marrying that insight with actionability is something we've tried to do on a consistent basis in nearly everything we put out there, from a deliverable perspective, always trying to kind of hit on and answer that question of like, so what? Or, you know, even more importantly, like, now what? So kind of, you know, our process was interesting, and it sort of started as sort of this notion of like, well, you know, we're doing great work, we're sending it out, it's getting in people's inboxes. We can tell through you know, the email tools that we have that they're opening the emails, they're forwarding these emails, people are getting asked, are constantly getting added to our distribution lists. But how can we ensure that the information that we're sharing, where there is an inherent actionable component to a lot of the insights that we're sending through, actually lead to anything or go anywhere? And so, what I found after a lot of trial and error was essentially, you know, we had to build a process, and it had to sort of be a always on kind of feedback loop. And so what we ended up doing was just we signed up with a project management tool. And then we built that tool with the respective stakeholders that we most commonly and actively share social intelligence derived insights with. And we built that in so that they would get notified when we share something new. And that way you have what I think is the most important component of, you know, kind of creating this feedback loop is the accountability. So it's like, you know, we can only do so much to find the information, you know, distill it down and package it up and storytell in a meaningful way. But like, we're not the ones going out and creating a new flavor of Dr. Pepper. We're not the ones going out and, you know, designing the newest accessory for Keurig brewers. We're not the ones deciding ultimately on which, you know, A-list celebrity we're going to partner with for one of our brands. But we can help inform some of the thought processes and like validate or disprove hypotheses that go into those decisions. And so by having kind of tracking and sort of a formal process around that, we've been really able to kind of demonstrate and showcase, like, look, this is all the good work we are sharing. And ultimately it's getting routed to the right people. And there is a paper trail that exists in sort of automations that are built in to help us kind of streamline this mechanism and this process. And, you know, our focus for that sort of program and this notion of using a project management tool and adding certain stakeholders is mainly based today around sort of what we call like opportunistic moments, quote unquote, opportunistic moments, and the different ways that we think the business can action on certain insights or, you know, findings, trends, opportunities, et cetera. So, you know, it's been a work in progress. It continues to be a work in progress. There's a lot of different stakeholders, and, you know, we rely heavily on the project management software to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us, but we feel pretty good about the fact that we've created sort of this, again, like always on feedback loop to help not only share the information in a more efficient way, but track what happens to that information to ideally ensure that it gets actioned on. Because, you know, we can only do so much as sort of our version of being subject matter experts for social intelligence isn't necessarily mean we're professional project managers or going to help, you know, design the next Keurig brewer. So it's sort of the genesis and the primary reason for all of this, you know, kind of selfishly, was to ensure we were able to demonstrate and showcase what exactly our team does and the impact that we have in the organization. And sort of the output of that is a more operationalized kind of feedback loop of make sure this stuff gets action.
Rob, so when it comes to like putting these, you know, because there's a difference between seeing something or a signal or like a finding and then an insight, right? Is there a initiative to always try to tie that insight to some type of KPI, whether it's, ROI, revenue, action, like,
Yep.
is that a good practice? I would think that personally, if I'm going to go to the bat with something, I'm going to try to hit a home run every time. So I'm going to have the insight, what I think we can do with it, and how it's going to impact the bottom line. Is that something that practitioners should get into the practice of to kind of help things move along? Because you're trying to prove the ROI of these customers in the wild, right?
Yep.
And get more budget, more bandwidth, more, tools on that side. So, I mean, would that be a good path to go with it, or do you guys do stuff like that?
Yeah, we certainly try to. I think it's still sort of an unsolved opportunity for us to kind of navigate, is directly tying the work that we're sharing and the opportunities that we're sharing to specific business KPIs. But kind of going back to what you were saying as far as how detailed or how prescriptive should we be with this? I don't think there's a downside to it's going to be inherently biased and subjective when you're being here is the potential action, because you're sort of making some assumptions for the stakeholders. But what we found is those are assumptions that we are confident in making, but the teams, the stakeholders that are looking at this information don't necessarily have to make that exact decision or that action. They can just use it as inspiration and sort of a thought starter. And so when we're finding groups of influential people talking about, we do this all the time right now for our brand Donut Shop has refreshers and K-Cup pods, and it has exploded on TikTok. And so we're constantly finding, people who are talking about refreshers on social media, and, they have a large following, they'd be considered everything between a micro and a macro influencer. And we are kind of unearthing some of those creators and suggesting this would be somebody good that we should maybe consider as a potential paid influencer partner, because they're organically talking about the product and they're pitching it to their, million followers. Or we can, go a step further, have them be part of an influencer program with us. Maybe we send them a custom PR mailer kit, and also, let's potentially do a content collab with them based off of, this awesome video they put together that was, high res and certainly kind of checked all the boxes from what we typically would look like, what we would typically look for, and how we promote and curate content around that specific product. So, we don't kind of withhold ideas or thought starters when it comes to what could be considered actionable. We'd rather just put those out there and then let the relevant stakeholders that are ultimately in charge of making those decisions decide what they want to consider and what they don't. I mean, that's why we're not going to necessarily filter out everything. It's pretty clear when something wouldn't resonate or wouldn't be on brand for specific opportunities that we're maybe discovering. But if we're going to have a challenger mindset with some of our brands, I think it's important that we don't necessarily withhold information that could be a cool idea or lead to increased sales or generate a lot more brand awareness around something. So
yeah, I think that's just the path that you have to take if the organization isn't holding this social intelligence at the top of food chain, right? So, but consistency and kind of showing up with these ideas, and not an eye test, not another graph, but something real and tangible that gets a decision maker or a strategic lever to pull into your idea, I think is the main goal. But kind of wrapping up the last question, well, two questions, right? But we'll start with this one. If you could give one piece of advice to a team struggling to get this recognition, what would it be?
Yeah, because I've been there, so I know what it's like to try to sort of kind of break through the noise, and there's so much information being shared around an organization, irregardless of how big the company is. There's just a lot of data out there. So, I think it kind of starts with sort of the notion of not waiting for a seat, at the table. You kind of have to interject yourself. And I'm not saying immediately start sending reports to your CEO, but I think it's important to start, taking initiative and trying to curate some of this information in a way that makes sense for different audiences. And so I think finding those moments to kind of insert insight into conversation that matters
Mm-hmm.
is certainly important. I think also just trying to have an understanding and sort of like the ability to sort of package up your wins
Yeah.
historically and like demonstrate that value that you've shown to certain teams, and then kind of socializing those outcomes or those cool case studies and impact stories internally. That makes the value of the work visible, but
Mm-hmm.
it's but it's also a way to sort of unearth the capability a little bit more. And then also like finding and sort of identifying those internal champions. We have plenty here at KDP, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And they're obviously super helpful advocates of what we're doing. But I think finding sort of those influential people internally can help amplify the work. And then I don't think it hurts to sort of go out and borrow and get inspiration from other teams, whether that is internally, within the org. Maybe there's some teams there that have like a kind of gold standard for how they are recognized as a top contributor. So it's like borrowing their templates or looking at what they send in their emails or trying to understand the stakeholders that they're working directly with and the audiences they may have internally to try to sort of compare to what you would want to achieve. And then I think outside of the organization is equally as important. I'm part of a lot of different groups within the social intelligence space where we share and exchange information exactly like this. And so I think the notion of networking with peers that work in the industry and trying to understand what were their key wins and how did they get to where they were, that goes a long way.
Yeah. Success definitely leaves clues. I'm a product of learning from individuals that are smarter and better at this than I am. Specifically, the early adopters of the niche fire tool, right? Rob, you are one of those ones. When you're talking about those findings and communicating that, you make me think about orange juice and coffee. That one thing, and it's funny that trend's popping back up, but with lemonade.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, it's summertime, right? Lemonade. Here we go. It's
Lemonade
it's
and
back.
coffee, crazy.
Yep. Why not at this point?
But Rob, man, I can't believe we've been talking for last 30 minutes or so. I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of lead the audience with a piece of advice or thought leadership or something that you hold dear. And again, kind of speaking to those individuals that are trying to advance their careers. I've seen you do it. Talking about that orange juice and coffee report. I think that's around the time where we first kind of met and started talking about stuff. And I can just remember you wanting to get things going, but you couldn't. And going from there to where you are now, it's been great to kind of watch your journey. So I think you got a lot that you could share. So let's sign off after this. We'll give you we'll give you the stage to go ahead and give something good to the audience. But what would that be if for your last remarks on the pod today?
Yeah, appreciate the kind words, Khalil. That means a lot. I would just encourage everybody to not kind of be scared to network and ask questions. And, I just alluded to the fact that there's groups out there, like-minded individuals that are probably trying to figure out exactly what you're going through right now. Reach out to them, reach out to me. There's a whole group of people now. It's really inspiring to see between Social Intelligence Lab and socialmedia.org and all these other groups of folks coming together with similar issues and similar pain points and similar struggles that they're trying to navigate and work through. But always look for others to help with some of these issues. I have never ever turned down a conversation where somebody's just saying hey, curious, want to pick your brain on this. How do you handle this or how do you approach this? I think those types of conversations are super helpful for both the folks involved, and I always get a lot out of them, and I hope the people that I chat with do as well. And so I just encourage people to reach out to me, other people in the industry. I'm sure other folks that have been on your pod, Khalil. I don't want to speak for them, but I know for a fact that they'd be more than happy to chat. But learn by doing, but also learn from others that have done it, and always happy to have conversations.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me today, Khalil. It's been
Absolutely,
great.
Rob. And if it's anything, just remember, guys, we work in social media. You have to be social. Right? And reach out. I know it gets a little scary sometimes. And if you got an idea, you don't want people to say it's dumb, but keeping that in is actually the dumb part of it. You gotta communicate that. So Rob, thank you for those words. I appreciate you having you on the pod. We finally made it happen after like 12 reschedules on both ends of us.
We did it.
So I appreciate your patience with that for me. I appreciate our audience for checking us out. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Share if this was compelling. If there was something that Rob talked about that would help a friend that are in a particular roadblock or something like that, like share that over. We're like a community of just helping people advance themselves, and we just really appreciate you guys checking out the pod, and come check us out for the next episode. Peace. All right, let me stop it.